I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. Namrata Goswami, an independent scholar on international relations, subject matter expert with the Futures Laboratory. She's currently working on a new book focused on China's grand strategy and notions of territoriality, and joins us to discuss the current state of China's relations with Taiwan. So Namrata, welcome back. We did an interview just a little while ago, and I'm actually really excited about this one because I think we're going to be tackling some big, very relevant and very important issues. So let me get started by asking you if you can give me kind of a brief overview of the new book on Chinese strategy that you're working on, and when you think that will probably hit publication.
Thank you. It's great to be back again. And I agree that this particular topic we are discussing today is so timely and relevant. So the book that I'm working, it's still in a very starting phase. So I'm working on looking at China's grand strategy, political culture, and notions of territoriality. So within the book, what I'm trying to do is to understand the different streams of Chinese grand strategic thinking, to include Han Feizi, Sun Tzu, and the Warring State period, and then trying to see how that ancient thinking on strategy and political culture actually influences China's current group of leaders. And so in the chapters of the book, there will be chapters on Hu Jintao's thought, which was focused on scientific development, Deng Xiaoping and the opening up to the world, Yang Zemin's Three Represents, and Xi Jinping's very interesting China Dream. And then I think in terms of publication date, I am hoping to turn in a manuscript by November of 2021. And then it takes about 6 months for peer review. And then depending on the peer review, revision suggestions, I'm hoping by the summer of 2022.
Okay, so this is down the road a ways. We're definitely touching on this early. And actually the impetus for me wanting to interview you was because you do have this expertise. You have a background in Sino-American international relations, Indian international relations, as well as an in-depth background on space programs by various nations. And so there's a lot going on right now in Taiwan, and really that was what I wanted to focus on. But let's start by talking about the One China policy. Now, this asserts that there's only one sovereign state of China, and under the 1992 consensus, both the Communist People's Republic of China and the Taiwanese Republic of China, they both agree that there's only one Chinese state, but they completely disagree on which government is the legitimate ruler of it. Can you tell me a little bit about this policy?
Absolutely. So the One China policy was basically an informal discussion between the Strait Exchange Foundation, which was representing Taiwan, and the Association for Relations Across the Taiwan Straits, which is the Chinese version of that particular informal grouping. So in that grouping, there were verbal exchanges of what is the idea or the notion of One China. And I think both agreed verbally. So there's no written record of the 1992 consensus, as they say, in which they agreed to have one China with a notion of China with respective interpretations and definitions. And from which came out the concept of the China principle. So I think in the United States, sometimes there is a conflation of the One China policy of the United States and the One China principle, but they're actually two very different concepts. So in terms of the One China principle, which is the Chinese version, the only government that is legitimate is the People's Republic of China. By extension, the Taiwanese government, which is the Republic of China, is an autonomous government or is not the legitimate government. It's a semi-autonomous government under the People's Republic of China. And in the China principle concept, it's clearly stated that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China. So it is a part of China, which includes mainland China and Taiwan. Now, the Taiwanese version, the Republic of China version, is that, of course, there is a Chinese nation of which Taiwan and the mainland China is a part, but the Republic of China is the de jure state that has sovereignty over Chinese mainland. So there are two very different concepts in terms of the 1992 consensus. And so in that context, both Taiwan and the People's Republic of China agreed to have diplomatic relations based on that consensus. And so they agreed that there is one China, but there are, of course, respective interpretations of it.
Mm. Okay, now, so the Washington Post has written that China considers Taiwan a breakaway state that must be reunified with the mainland government. And the reason I cited the Washington Post is that's actually a very recent, I believe that was October 2020 article. And so this is, again, this is current events. They consider Taiwan to be a breakaway state that must be reunified with the mainland government. And Bloomberg also very recently said that Xi Jinping wants to cement his legacy by regaining the lost territory. So are these news stories accurate in saying that China wants Taiwan back and that it isn't content with the two government system as you've just described it?
Absolutely. So since 1949, when China became a separate independent nation and Taiwan was established as a separate self-governing area as well, the goal of the Communist Party of China has been the reunification of the Chinese nation. And by that, I mean reunification not just of Taiwan, but also Tibet, which they occupied in 1950, Hong Kong, Macau, and several other disputed territories that they have with India, with Bhutan, with the South China Sea Islands and the East China Sea Islands. Now, in that context, what the People's Republic of China wants to achieve is the reunification of Taiwan, and which, as you said, they view as a breakaway province. And they actually view those, for instance, the Kuomintang or the Democratic Progressive Party in Taiwan, whenever they talk about independence, as separatist groups. So they view Taiwan as a part of China historically, and they obviously want to reunify with Taiwan. And this particular push has become even more strong under President Xi Jinping, because his primary goal is the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And by that, he means reunification with Taiwan as well. Now, before I end, I think I need to say that when we talk about the China principle and the US-China policy, so when we talk about the US One China policy, it does not mean that the United States has agreed to support China's One China principle, which is that Taiwan is a part of China. What the US One China policy is that it acknowledges that China has this perspective, but it also acknowledges that Taiwan and Taiwan's population has a different perspective. And so it agrees to have acknowledgement so that it can have a diplomatic relation with China.
Ah, okay. Now, to that note, and again, going back to the disagreement between these two nation states, I've read that China has been pressuring governments and corporations not to recognize Taiwan as a sovereign state for some time. Would it be accurate to say that they've been setting the stage to reclaim Taiwan, or are they just kind of reaffirming a policy that comes out of this 1992 consensus?
I think they are creating the legitimate ground for reunification with Taiwan. And so if you look at their diplomatic relations, so one of the conditions that China sets when you start diplomatic relations with China is that you have to either recognize Taiwan as part of China, or you have to say nothing about what Taiwan's status is. The moment you say that Taiwan is an independent country, China refuses to have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, with that country. So example I'll give you is that when Taiwan was established under Chiang Kai-shek, who fought against the Communist Party, the United States agreed to secure and come to the defense of Taiwan between 1956 and 1979. They had a mutual defense treaty, which obligated the US to come to the defense of Taiwan. But then, as you know, Jimmy Carter established diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And one of the conditions was that this particular treaty had to be negated. So you can see the pressure that China brought to bear in terms of actually putting to an end the defense treaty that the Republic of China and the United States had. Instead, the US, of course, has a Taiwan Relations Act, But that does not obligate the US to come to the defense of Taiwan, unlike, say, the US-Japan security arrangement. So you can see that China actually has been using its diplomatic capability to ensure that Taiwan does not have the kind of legitimacy. And the important thing is that the United Nations does not recognize Taiwan as a separate state. China is the representative for the Chinese nation in the Security Council, which took the seat of the Republic of China. And so China is creating that legitimate diplomatic and international background where a situation will come that Taiwan will reunify with the Chinese mainland and the Chinese nation.
Now, the reason I'd asked that, I'm trying to kind of, again, everything that we've covered so far, this is these issues all go back decades, but the tensions have been increasing. And just this month, China threatened to attack Taiwan, which comes on the heels of, again, rising tensions in the South China Sea, with aggressive military drills in the Taiwan area when an American diplomat recently visited. So I'm wondering, again, this disagreement about sovereignty and the rightful ruler of China, I guess, that goes back decades. But what seems like it's changing is an increase in aggressiveness and just general tension in the region. Can you tell me a little bit about what you think that might mean?
So if you remember, President Xi Jinping gave a speech on the 40th anniversary of the speech given to the Taiwan compatriots, as they call them, in 1979. So he gave a 40th anniversary speech in January last year, in which he indicated what China's Taiwan policy is, and that is, he made the commitment that there will be no use of violence. At least they hope that they would reunify with Taiwan peacefully. So it'll be a peaceful reunification. And so there will not be the use of violence as the first result. So they will try to unify with Taiwan peacefully if possible. And then he said, Chinese don't fight Chinese. So we are civilizationally together. We are the same ethnic community. So we don't really fight with our brethren. But if you remember, he also did not commit to not use force as a last resort. So force is always on the table for China. The recent activity and increase in aggression from the Chinese side is, in President Xi's strategic conceptualization, signaling to the United States not to establish official relationship with Taiwan. So the US does not have a consulate in Taiwan. It functions through an informal body called the American Center in Taiwan. And so the relationship, while existing, while we have military sales, weapon systems are sold like the F-16, it's not a formal, official diplomatic relationship. I think what China was trying to do through its signaling, especially to the United States, is that the moment there is the inclination or there is the suggestion that this relationship is getting more formalized, for instance, as you said, the visit of Mr. Craig, who went there as the Undersecretary for Economy and Environmental Issues, because he went for the funeral services of President Lee, who had died. But then there were these meetings as well. And then you had the highest level visit by an American diplomat, Health Secretary Azar. And so China's response was that these seems like official meetings, which means that Taiwan might be trying to become independent. So it's a kind of signaling to the US that don't think that we will not respond to this kind of diplomatic meetings between the United States representatives and Taiwan.
Okay. So I guess this leads to a couple of big questions then. And it sounds like they are attempting to pursue peaceful reunification. From what you've said, it sounds like that is kind of the long-term goal, which I think is very reassuring. But if that doesn't happen, do you think that China will at some point invade Taiwan to reclaim it or reunify? And based on what you know of Xi Jinping and the Communist Party's leadership, what kind of timetable might exist there?
So as I said, what President Xi said is that we will try to reunify peacefully, but force is not ruled out. And I think if one of the speeches he gave is that we cannot leave the reunification of Taiwan to generations coming after us, which means that he's 67 years old now. So he's hoping that within his lifetime, Taiwan will reunify with the Chinese mainland and become that nation of China. And so I think if I think of a timeline, if there is moves for independence from Taiwan's side, if the Democratic Progressive Party talks about a referendum, which happened in 2004 under President Shen, who actually talked about a referendum from Taiwan's population of 28 million. Now, if that happens, I think I do not count out the fact that China will attempt to take over Taiwan with the use of force. You can see that in President Xi's focus on naval modernization, modernizing the Air Force, and shifting the focus from the People's Liberation Army, because I think they realize that if you have to take over Taiwan, you have to invest in your naval and Air Force capability. And so I would say that we have to be very carefully watching this in a decade from now, 2030, and then probably another decade if things do not change or it escalates.
Yeah. And so the reason I'd asked was, this isn't a great example, but the example that came to mind for me was Hong Kong. Now, China, they patiently waited for a century to reunify with Hong Kong, and that was peaceful. And I would say that the reintroduction of the national security law, from what I've read in the media, that was, I guess, kind of another step towards completing the reunification there, right? So they brought them back into the fold gently, and then they made them more a part of communist China. And so I guess that's one type of approach. But I guess the other type of approach might be force. And if it did go that direction, as you said, Xi Jinping probably doesn't want to wait for generations to come. If it did become an action of force, Taiwan's been around since 1949, and they have a lot of international relationships. Do you think the United States or the European nations would be involved in something like that if it came to a force action?
I would say that Taiwan is not just important in terms of US credibility in the region, because that's what it comes to. So the world is watching. So in case there is an escalation of conflict, countries in Asia, especially countries like Japan, Vietnam, India too, will watch how the US will respond to such a situation, because after all, the US has been one of the factors why China has not escalated the conflict. So Taiwan is not Tibet. So Tibet was occupied because Tibet did not have a US guarantee. Taiwan stayed self-governing because the United States in the beginning offered a guarantee. So I think in that context, I think the United States will have to do something in response to if Taiwan is invaded by China. The second important thing is that it's not just about credibility, it's also about the strategic importance of Taiwan. So Taiwan is located in a way that it offers amazing strategic insight into what's happening in the East China Sea, what's happening around the South China Sea. It offers the United States, as they call, an unsinkable aircraft carrier. And so think of a hypothetical scenario if China takes over Taiwan. That means that the DF-21C, which is China's long-range missile, can target Guam, which is a US base. It's about 2,150 kilometers or 1,700 miles to be precise, away from Taiwan. And the Chinese DF-21 has that particular range. So you can see that there are other strategic implications if the United States does not come to the assistance of Taiwan. I think Europe would also get involved, because it would mean creating legitimate structures where you are countering Chinese aggression in areas where the population does not want China to take over. Taiwanese have a different identity than China. They're ethnically Chinese, but they identify as Taiwanese. And so they are a vibrant democracy. And so these are the reasons that would actually obligate the US. Now, I'll say that with a measure of caution, because as I said before, there is no treaty obligation for the United States to come to the defense of Taiwan. In a situation, if China invades, Taiwan will have to ensure that it's able to deter a Chinese takeover for at least some weeks before the US can deploy or its forces reach Taiwan, because there is distance. Pacific is far away from the US mainland. So you have to consider all those scenarios as well.
Well, and you mentioned the strategic importance of Taiwan. And one of the things I've been looking at it from more of a business perspective, I guess. And, in my mind, I guess there is somewhat of a quandary because, if I try to visualize it as the Chinese might, I would say this is a breakaway rebellious state. We've reclaimed, we've reunified with Hong Kong. We'd like to reunify with them, right? So from their perspective, I guess I can understand part of that, but I guess from a business perspective, there's not only strategy. From a business perspective, the United States has nearly $100 billion a year in trade with Taiwan, with the Republic of China, and $700 billion a year in trade with the Communist People's Republic of China. So that's a lot of disruption. What do you think would happen if it came to some kind of a war or some kind of a force action? Would we continue trading with both parties, or do you think that we would end up doing some kind of an embargo or something along those lines?
So I think what would happen if that scenario comes to fruition, that China takes over Taiwan, and Taiwan, as you know, is one of the leading electronics, they basically are one of the key suppliers, including semiconductors and chips. I think it probably will follow the trajectory of Hong Kong. So when China took over Hong Kong continued to remain very vibrant, despite the fact that the United Kingdom gave over Hong Kong to China in 1997. It had one of the most vibrant economies. It was one of the leading technical service sectors, retail. And so that would continue. I think the difference here, though, would be that there will be some disruption in the supply chain because of the fact that the Taiwan was truly self-governing in terms of how it conducted its business. It was a more capitalist kind of system, whereas China is more socialist with capitalist characteristics, right? So that will have an impact. But I think what we can see is that what happened with COVID, we had disruption of supply chains during COVID, trade sanctions, other differences. But then because the world is dependent on China for vital supplies, including ventilators and N95 masks, countries were forced to then accommodate this difference in China's supply chain despite COVID, including the US. Which was very much dependent on China, not just for ventilators, but also for very critical medical supplies for American citizens. So I think a similar kind of scenario can be thought through in Taiwan. For instance, Taiwan's Foxconn is actually one of the biggest assembler for Apple's iPhones. But the important point is that if a scenario comes to we have to deal with it, that now Taiwan is under China. I think despite that, global companies will be forced to actually address that new reality. But it will lead to some short-term supply chain disruptions. That's very sure.
Well, and that was actually one of the things, that was what I was going to get to next. I wanted to ask about technology supply chain security. Taiwan's TSMC supplies 48% of the global chip market, and Foxconn is the world's #1 electronics manufacturing service. So you'd mentioned that there may be some short-term disruption in those supply chains, and that was one of my concerns, especially if, in the case of a peaceful reunification, right, like we saw with Hong Kong, you'd mentioned that business was able to continue as usual for the most part, right? But if there was an action involving force between China and Taiwan, I guess my concern is how much would that disrupt the rest of the world in terms of supply chains?
I mean, I think as I said, it would disrupt supply chains in the short term, but I think countries will also adapt and diversify. I think what can happen is something that, and we can only see by past example, as I said, Hong Kong. So Hong Kong, of course, does not have what Taiwan is offering to the world in terms of electronics market and manufacturing, but Hong Kong had very similar facilities in terms of other sectors, including the service sector and also the industry sector. So what China did with Hong Kong, especially after the 2008 financial crisis, is that instead of keeping Hong Kong as the key stock exchange for Western markets, it actually diversified and created other cities like Shanghai, Beijing, and Shenzhen as the major stock exchanges for the world, especially for Western, engagement with China. I think what we can see here is that there will be a replication of Taiwan's model for cities like Shenzhen, which are already emerging as one of the biggest manufacturing hubs. So for instance, Foxconn's major manufacturing factory is in Shenzhen. So while it's headquartered in Taiwan, its assembly is done in China because it's diversifying its own supply chain. And in fact, Foxconn CEO said that if we lose, for instance, Apple's iPhone as a customer because of trade sanctions, we still have customers within China like Huawei and Xiaomi, who actually also manufactures their phones. So I think what we would see is disruption in the supply chain in a limited way, but I think there will be China's planning to meet that particular disruption because they realize that that's going to be the impact if they take over Taiwan. So they will already plan for such a scenario as we see in Hong Kong. But I think the important lesson that Hong Kong tells us is that we need to take seriously China's articulation of escalating the conflict with Taiwan. Because when Hong Kong protests started last year and Hong Kong lost its autonomy with the National Security Act, we realized that what China is doing with Taiwan is not very dissimilar. So by passing the National Security Act, President Xi signaled to the world that he does not care about international reputation. There was a lot of shaming for China passing the National Security Act in the National People's Congress, but they went ahead with it. So very similar is the case with Taiwan. Now, what President Xi has done in the last few years is that they have completely changed the meaning of the One China principle vis-a-vis Taiwan. So as I mentioned before, the One China principle is very different in terms of how Taiwan understands it and how China understands it. But today, China is equating the One China principle with the one country, two systems model, which is not the One China principle that they had originally agreed to. So the one country, two system is only limited to Hong Kong and Macau because they are parts of China. They were autonomous, but parts of China. But then now they are saying that, oh, but actually the One China principle is absolutely replicable with the one country, two systems possibility. And so you have Taiwanese President Tsai, who says that she decided not to give her consensus to the 1992 principle or the 1992 consensus, because if you give agreement, it means that you're agreeing with China's reinterpretation of the One China principle as the one country, two system. So think of how strategically clever China is in terms of changing the parameters of dealing with Taiwan.
Yeah, yeah. Well, now I guess, and I think we're almost done for today, but I did want to ask, do you think that China's success reintegrating Hong Kong has emboldened them in terms of Taiwan? And do you think that if they are able to reclaim or reunify with Taiwan, do you think that might further embolden them in terms of other territorial acquisitions?
Great question, because that's one of the key questions of my book that I'm writing as well. So one thing that you notice with Hong Kong is that it had two implications and consequences for China's behavior with other disputed territory. So one was that it told Taiwan that if Taiwan becomes a part of China, say in 20 years, let's take a scenario that Taiwan has reunified with China peacefully, like Hong Kong did, and which China wants. But China's behavior in Hong Kong would give any Taiwanese pause, because of the fact that it very slowly eroded Hong Kong's independent judiciary, free press, the rights of its people. So if it wants to give Hong Kong as an example to Taiwan that we are going to respect your property rights, we are going to respect your autonomous government, we are going to respect your free press, Hong Kong does not give you much confidence. So that's number one. So the second important point is that if you look at how China changes its adherence to particular agreements or consensus, as I mentioned, right? So for example, let's take the medium line. So we know that the recent conflict escalated because Chinese warplanes, including the J-10, the J-11, the J-16, the submarine warfare plane, crossed the medium line. So the medium line is a line in the Taiwan Straits, which is an unofficial line, but which both Taiwan and China unofficially acknowledge as the international line. And you don't cross it because crossing it means that you are threatening. So China crossed the line when the US diplomat was there in Taiwan as a signal that, look, you cannot be escalating official relationship. But then when China was asked about it, like, you have crossed the medium line, what does it mean? China's response was that with Taiwan, there is no question of medium line because Taiwan is a part of China. And given the fact that China has sovereignty over Taiwan, China has not done anything illegal. And you see very similar articulation with regard to Bhutan. So when Bhutan and China had a conflict, over a piece of territory in Doklam, which is high up in the Himalayas, and Bhutan pointed out to China that, we had signed agreements where we both agreed that we will not change the status quo. China turned around and said that, but Doklam was never included. So because it's part of our territory, whereas the fact is that they actually agreed on paper, unlike, say, Taiwan, China 1992 consensus, where there was no written document. A very similar behavior is seen in the South China Sea, where China agrees to particular principles, but then when they do something else and they are questioned, their Ministry of Foreign Affairs has the absolutely same line, that these areas were Chinese territories, so it was never included in the document. But the biggest strategic lesson is that when they were actually talking about these issues, they actually agreed that there was a dispute and they agreed to talk about it, and yet turn around and say that, no, there was no dispute, which tells you that in terms of Taiwan, I mean, you agree you first agree that there is one China principle, but different interpretations. You agree that Taiwan and China would have diplomatic relation based on the 1992 consensus. But then when, issues become strategic, you turn around and say that, no, this is actually not respective definitions. This is actually one China with two system, one country, two system, which is China's unilateral, definition of the conflict. But that can have very long-term consequences. And I'll end by saying this, that the one thing that China has so successfully done is that in the Human Rights Council, most of the countries that supported, there were about 53 countries that supported China's national security law vis-a-vis Hong Kong. About 23 or 20, I think 27 countries dissented, which means they had majority. Most of those countries that agreed were African countries, including Saudi Arabia that signed on, Pakistan that signed on, Sri Lanka that signed on. They're all members of the Belt and Road Initiative as well. So you can see a very similar situation that can play out with the China-Taiwan conflict as well. And because of distance, the fact that there is so much distance between the US and Taiwan, think of a scenario where Taiwan overwhelmingly takes over. China overwhelmingly takes over Taiwan. The response time itself will take more time, and China now has much more capability, including capability to put US, space-based satellites vulnerable. So you can see that they have built that capability.
Well, Namrata, let me close with one final question, if that's okay. And this goes to possible timelines. I'm just trying to look at the calendar and see the year 2021 is the first of two Chinese centuries. And I'm wondering if there may be public pressure or governmental pressure inside of the Chinese government for them that may be driving some of these increases in tension that we're seeing? And if so, do you think that we may see anything in the near future? Do you think we'll see a continued escalation through the next year? Or do you have any prognostications, I guess, as to what might happen the next few years?
Sure. So the China that we are dealing with today is not the China that we dealt with in 1949. That's number one. So they are globally integrated. They have built very strong influence mechanisms, including with several countries in Europe, Africa, Latin America. So in terms of that itself, China has already built an international structure where Taiwan's ability to maneuver is very limited. So countries that want diplomatic relation with China cannot have any relation with Taiwan, which is official, right? Including the US, which is a very unofficial relationship. So that's number one. Number two is that in terms of timelines. So 2021 is the 100-year celebration of the establishment of the Communist Party of China. So I think what I can foresee is that President Xi will give a speech where he will talk about the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. and he will stress on the fact that Taiwan should feel grateful and historically accept China as the only nation and become a part of China. Now, what Xi has promised in his Taiwan policy is that the government of the Republic of China will of course be dissolved, but they will have a semi-autonomous status, very similar to Tibet. They will actually be able to have property rights, which is interesting because property rights is a very difficult issue within China. They will continue with their taxation system. So what he will try to do is that in 2021, he'll try to create a kind of a narrative that feels or is a signaling to Taiwan that it's a good thing if Taiwan becomes a part of China. Now, I think what he realizes is that his actions in Hong Kong and his aggressive militarization of the Taiwan Strait has made Taiwanese more fearful, and the Democratic Progressive Party, which is in power now, has not agreed to give their consent to the 1992 consensus, which means that they are getting even more independent in their thinking away from China. The Kuomintang, which was very pro-China-Taiwan diplomatic relationship, especially under President Ma, has now been forced to actually say that they are not in support of the 1992 consensus because of China's strategic blunder, because it changed the meaning of the 1992 consensus to one party, two system. So now if Kuomintang gives support, Taiwanese will see them as disloyal to the concept of Taiwan. So I think the years that we need to watch is, as I said before, 2040. And I think the 100-year celebration of the establishment of the People's Republic of China is coming up, 2049. So China by then will aspire to peacefully integrate Taiwan into China by developing diplomatic relations, societal relationship, creating dissension within Taiwan, militarily building up. And I think they will play the long game because they know that finally the US patience might run out. You know, they're hoping that because that happened with other provinces. So those are the years that we'll need to think about very, very, very carefully. And I think I, as a grand strategist, will not rule out the use of force because of what I'm seeing, their modernization of their Navy, their development of missile capability to target US aircraft carriers, space-based weapon system. It all tells you that they are not just focusing on an area denial strategy, but they're also thinking about offensive strategy vis-a-vis Taiwan.